I was lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting my breaths, because each one felt like it might be my last. The oxygen tube pressed against my face, humming softly, the only thing keeping my lungs from giving out completely. The room smelled like disinfectant and plastic, and the light above me was too bright, too steady, as if nothing terrible could possibly be happening underneath it. My sister leaned over me and said, "Stop faking it. You just want pity." Before I could even process her words, she grabbed the tube and yanked it away. The air vanished instantly. It wasn't dramatic or gradual. It was just gone. My chest seized like it had collapsed inward, my ribs locking tight, as if my body had forgotten how breathing worked. I reached for her, my hands clumsy and weak fingers scraping against the sheets as black spots swam across my vision. The sound that came out of my throat didn't sound human. It was raw and panicked, and desperate, a noise pulled straight from instinct. I remember my parents standing a few feet away. My mother crossed her arms, her mouth set in that thin, impatient line she used when she thought I was being difficult. My father glanced down at his phone, scrolling as if this was something happening on a screen instead of right in front of him. No one moved. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. And then the door behind them opened. None of them noticed at first. None of them knew that the surgeon who had operated on me just hours earlier was standing there watching my sister step back as I fought to breathe. 2 weeks later at my grandfather's will reading, that same man would place a hand on my sister's shoulder and say 6 words that ended everything she thought she knew about our family. At the time, though, all I knew was the burning in my chest and the terrifying certainty that I was disappearing right in front of the people who were supposed to care whether I lived or died. I didn't scream for help. I couldn't. I didn't even try to beg. Some part of me buried deep under the panic already knew how this would go. I had learned that lesson a long time ago. When things went wrong, when I was hurting, when I needed something, the safest thing to do was stay quiet and wait for it to pass. My sister stood there watching me struggle, her face tight with irritation instead of fear. As if I'd spilled something on the carpet instead of losing consciousness. As if my body failing was an inconvenience she hadn't planned for. The oxygen was returned to my face in a blur of movement and voices I barely registered. Hands adjusted, straps checked, monitors spoke in clipped professional tones. I felt the air rush back into my lungs like fire, painful but necessary, and I sucked it in greedily, my body shaking as it tried to recover from what it had just been denied. When I finally stopped trembling when the room came back into focus, my sister was gone. I lay there afterward, staring at the same ceiling tiles, my throat raw and my chest aching, trying to understand how something so violent could have happened so quietly. No shouting, no struggle, just a decision made in seconds, carried out without hesitation. What hurt most wasn't the pain or even the fear. It was the realization that none of it surprised me. My parents' silence in that room wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. It was familiar. It fit into a pattern that had been forming since I was a child, one I had learned to navigate so well that I barely noticed it anymore. I was the daughter who learned early how to disappear. Growing up, my sister was always the one who needed more patience, more protection, more understanding. She was delicate, they said, sensitive, easily overwhelmed. Life was hard on her, and it was our job to soften it. I was the other one, the older one, the strong one. If I fell, I was expected to get up. If I cried, I was told I'd be fine. If something hurt, the assumption was that I could handle it because I always had. Strength wasn't praised in our house. It was required. I learned quickly that attention came at a cost, that asking for help meant being labeled dramatic, that showing pain made things uncomfortable for everyone else. So I stopped doing it. I solved my own problems. I kept my head down. I made myself easy to live with. Over time, it became second nature. I didn't even realize I was doing it anymore. That habit followed me into adulthood. It followed me into my career, my relationships, and eventually into that hospital room. Even as my chest tightened and my vision darkened, a part of my mind whispered the same familiar doubt. Don't overreact. Don't make this bigger than it is. You're fine. You've always been fine. That voice almost killed me. When the nurse came in later to check my vitals, she asked softly how I was feeling. The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because no one in my family had bothered to ask it. I'm okay, I said automatically, even though my hands were still shaking. She didn't look convinced. She adjusted my oxygen, made a note on her chart, and told me to rest. Real rest this time. After she left the room, went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Heavier. Watchful. Somewhere beyond the walls of that hospital, plans were being made. Phone calls about estates and appointments and schedules were already happening, I was sure of it. Life, as far as my family was concerned, was moving forward. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Lying there alone, breathing carefully through plastic tubing, I realized that what had happened wasn't just an accident or a moment of cruelty. It was the natural outcome of years of being unseen, unheard, and expected to endure whatever was placed in front of me without complaint. I didn't know yet how the truth would come out. I didn't know what the surgeon had seen or what he intended to do with it. I only knew that something in me had finally reached its limit. I was still breathing. I was still alive. And for the first time in my life, I understood that disappearing had never kept me safe. What hurt most about that hospital room wasn't the pain in my chest or the fear that followed. It was the fact that I wasn't surprised. As I lay there afterward, breathing carefully through the oxygen, I realized I had already known how my parents would react. Or rather, how they wouldn't. Their silence didn't shock me. It fit. I had grown up inside that silence. From the time I was young, my sister was the center of everything. She was smaller, more fragile, more emotional. That was how it was explained to me. She needed extra care, extra patience, extra understanding. Life was harder for her, my parents said, and it was our responsibility to make it easier. I was the older one, the sturdy one, the one who could handle things. If my sister cried, the house stopped. Voices softened. Plans shifted. If I cried, I was told not to make a scene. If she struggled, it was a crisis. If I struggled, it was a phase I'd grow out of. The difference wasn't dramatic or cruel on the surface. It was subtle, quiet, repeated so often that it became the background noise of our lives. Strength in our house wasn't admired. It was assumed. I learned early that being easy made life smoother for everyone else. I learned that needing less attention earned me approval even if it cost me something inside. When I did well in school, it was expected. When my sister did anything at all, it was celebrated. I stopped waiting for praise and told myself I didn't need it anyway. There was a moment when I was a kid that I still remember clearly, though I didn't think much of it at the time. I had come home from school feeling sick, my head pounding my stomach tight with pain. I told my mother I didn't feel well and asked if I could lie down. She sighed and told me to wait until after dinner because my sister had a recital that night and everything was already rushed. I waited. I always did. That night, as I lay awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, listening to my parents gush over my sister's performance in the kitchen, I learned something important. I learned that my discomfort was negotiable, that my needs could be postponed indefinitely, that staying quiet made things easier for everyone else, even if it made things harder for me. That lesson stayed with me. As I got older, it shaped the way I moved through the world. I became independent out of necessity, not confidence. I took care of my own problems because it felt safer than asking for help and being dismissed. I learned how to smile and nod and say I was fine even when I wasn't. Especially when I wasn't. My sister, meanwhile, grew into her role. She learned that attention was something she deserved, that someone would always step in for her, that mistakes could be smoothed over, excuses made, consequences softened. She didn't have to ask for help. It came to her automatically. I don't think she ever questioned it. By the time we were adults, the pattern was set. My parents still hovered around her, still worried about her happiness, her comfort, her future. I was the reliable one, the one they didn't have to check on, the one they trusted to be okay no matter what. I told myself that was a compliment. Looking back, I can see how deeply that belief was rooted in me. Even as my health worsened in the weeks leading up to the hospital, I brushed off the warning signs: tightness in my chest, fatigue that didn't go away, shallow breaths that left me dizzy. I told myself it was stress, that it would pass, that I didn't need to make a fuss. When the symptoms became impossible to ignore, my first instinct wasn't fear. It was guilt. I worried about how inconvenient this would be for everyone else. I worried about the timing. I worried about being seen as dramatic. Even in the ambulance, even as strangers took my condition seriously enough to rush me to the hospital, a small voice in my head kept whispering the same thing it always had. Don't overreact. That voice didn't come from nowhere. It had been trained into me over years of quiet corrections and unspoken expectations. It was the voice of a child who learned that being invisible was safer than being needy. The voice of a daughter who learned to disappear without anyone asking her to. In that hospital room, when my sister stood over me and decided I was faking, that voice tried to speak again. It told me to stay calm, to wait it out, to trust that if things were truly serious, someone would step in. That belief died there. For the first time, I saw our family dynamic with terrifying clarity. My sister wasn't just accustomed to attention. She was accustomed to power, to being believed, to being protected even when she was wrong. And my parents weren't just absent. They were complicit in ways I had spent my life excusing. I didn't feel angry yet. Anger would come later. In that moment, what I felt was something colder and heavier. Recognition. I understood finally that my role in the family had never been accidental. I had been shaped into the one who endured, who absorbed, who made space for everyone else. And that role had followed me all the way into a hospital bed where my silence nearly cost me my life. As I lay there afterwards, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the oxygen machine, I felt something crack open inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let in a truth I could no longer ignore. If I didn't stop disappearing, no one else was going to save me. That realization didn't make me brave. It didn't make me strong. It made me aware. And awareness, I was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous thing of all. The funeral was quiet in the way important things often are, heavy with lowered voices and careful movements, as if everyone was afraid to disturb something fragile. I arrived a few minutes late and slipped into the back of the room, taking a seat near the aisle where I could leave easily if I needed to. No one turned around. No one noticed. My sister stood at the front with my parents, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with soft, practiced sobs. People moved toward her instinctively, offering tissues, squeezing her hands, murmuring sympathy. She leaned into them, accepting comfort, as if it were her natural position in the world. My mother kept an arm around her shoulders, protective and proud. My father stood close, nodding gravely, as relatives spoke to him about how strong she had been, how devoted. I watched from my seat, as if I were observing a play I'd seen too many times before. When the service ended, the room filled with the low hum of conversation. People gathered in small clusters, exchanging memories, making plans for lunch, discussing travel arrangements. I stayed where I was, waiting for the crowd to thin. I had learned long ago that it was easier that way, less explaining, less discomfort. As I stood, I caught fragments of conversation drifting past me. She was there constantly, someone said, glancing toward my sister. Such a comfort to him at the end. He always worried about making sure she'd be taken care of, another voice replied. He was very clear about that. I paused, my hand resting on the back of a chair. Taken care of. The phrase landed strangely heavier than it should have. I looked toward my sister again. She wasn't crying anymore. She was listening, her expression composed, almost serene. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. I stood near the steps of the building, pulling my coat tighter around me, trying to breathe past the tightness in my chest that grief always seemed to bring with it. I told myself it was just the day, just the emotions, just exhaustion. My sister found me there a few minutes later. She approached with a soft smile, her voice low and gentle, as if we were sharing something private. "I wondered where you'd gone," she said, touching my arm lightly. "I thought you might need a moment." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. She stood beside me, gazing out at the parking lot. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming in the cold air. "You know," she said quietly, "some of us were there when it really mattered." I felt my stomach drop. "He talked a lot about loyalty." She continued, her tone almost kind. "About showing up. About who he could depend on." I swallowed. "I called him every week," I said before I could stop myself. "We talked all the time." She glanced at me, her smile tightening just a little. "I know," she said, "but calls aren't the same as being there." "Not really." She straightened and smoothed her coat as if preparing to leave. "I just thought you should be prepared," she added. "There are things you might not expect." Prepared for what she didn't say. She didn't have to. As she walked away, a knot formed in my chest, slow and deliberate. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that grief made people say strange things, that whatever decisions had been made weren't about me. They never were. Inside, my parents were already talking logistics with a distant cousin. Papers, appointments, timelines. No one asked if I wanted to be included. I hovered nearby, listening, feeling like an observer at my own family gathering. At one point, my mother turned to me with a distracted expression. "We'll be meeting with the lawyer soon," she said, "just to go over everything." "Everything?" I asked. She waved a hand vaguely. "The usual things, the house, accounts, you know." I nodded, even though I didn't know. Or maybe I did and just didn't want to admit it. Over the next few days, the tone in the house shifted. Phone calls came and went. My parents spoke in hushed voices behind closed doors. My sister moved through the space with a new confidence, making plans aloud, talking about the future in ways that assumed certain outcomes. "Once everything is settled," she said more than once, "things will be easier." I noticed she'd stopped pretending to include me in those plans. She no longer softened her words or checked my reactions. It was as if, in her mind, the question had already been answered. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own insecurities onto neutral events. I reminded myself that my grandfather had loved me in his own quiet way, that fairness still existed in the world, even if it hadn't always existed in my family. But the unease didn't go away. Late one evening, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. They didn't see me in the hallway. "She's counting on this," my father said. "We can't let things get complicated now." My mother sighed. "I know. She's been under so much stress." Neither of them said my name. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the day settling into my bones. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that whatever was coming might not just leave me disappointed. It might leave me unprotected. That night, as I lay awake listening to the house creak and settle, I felt the familiar pressure in my chest return heavier than before. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd rest in the morning, that things would work themselves out the way they always had. But beneath that reassurance was a growing certainty I couldn't ignore. Something important was being decided without me. And whatever it was, I had a terrible feeling I was standing directly in its way. By the time night settled over the house, my body had started sending signals I could no longer ignore. It wasn't sharp pain at first, just a deep, spreading tightness in my chest, as if something heavy had been placed there and forgotten. Each breath felt shorter than the last. I tried to tell myself it was grief exhaustion, the altitude, anything that sounded temporary. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table listening to my parents talk in the living room about appointments and paperwork. My sister's voice floated above theirs, confident and animated, already discussing what needed to happen next. No one noticed me sitting there, fingers wrapped around a mug I wasn't drinking from. I stood up too quickly and the room tilted. Black spots crept into the edges of my vision. I grabbed the counter and waited for it to pass. It usually did. This time it didn't. The tightness in my chest deepened, turning into pressure that made it hard to draw in air. I inhaled slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to do when my lungs acted up. It helped sometimes. Other times it didn't. I waited, counting in my head, trying to stay calm. "Don't overreact," the familiar voice whispered. "You're fine. You always are." I went to my room and sat on the bed, hoping rest would help. Instead, the air seemed to thin around me. Each breath felt like work. My ribs ached from the effort. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, focusing on not panicking. From down the hall, I heard my mother laugh at something my sister said. That was when fear finally broke through the habit of minimization. Not loud fear, not panic, just a quiet, unmistakable awareness that something was wrong. I reached for my phone, hesitated, then put it down again. Calling for help felt dramatic, embarrassing. I imagined my parents' expressions, the sighs, the irritation at another complication. I imagined my sister rolling her eyes. I tried lying back and breathing through it. The room started to spin. My breaths came out in shallow bursts, now my chest refusing to expand fully. I pressed a hand against it, feeling my heart race under my palm. The thought crossed my mind, uninvited and chilling, that if I fell asleep like this, I might not wake up. That was when I called for help. The operator's voice was calm and steady, asking questions I struggled to answer between breaths. The ambulance arrived faster than I expected. Bright lights, clipped voices, practiced hands. They took me seriously immediately. That alone felt strange, like stepping into a different world. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, my mother stood in the doorway, her expression tight with annoyance, more than concern. "This timing is really difficult," she said, as if apologizing to the paramedics on my behalf. "We have a lot going on." My father nodded, already pulling out his phone. "The lawyer's expecting us in the morning." My sister hovered behind them, arms crossed, her face unreadable. In the ambulance, oxygen was placed over my face, and the relief was immediate and overwhelming. I closed my eyes, letting the cool air fill my lungs, my body finally easing out of its frantic struggle. I focused on that sensation, on staying present, on not slipping away. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Tests, monitors, doctors speaking in efficient tones. I was admitted without hesitation, the word dangerously low repeated more than once. The oxygen stayed with me, a constant humming reassurance. When my family arrived the next morning, I expected questions, concern, something. Instead, my mother stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, her mouth set in that familiar line. "You always make things more complicated," she said. "We really don't have time for this right now." "I couldn't breathe," I said quietly. She sighed. "You're breathing now." My father barely looked at me. "We'll come back later," he said, "after we handle some things." My sister examined her nails. "She's probably exaggerating," she said casually. "She's always been dramatic when things get stressful." I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't something I could control or push through. But the words felt heavy and pointless in my mouth. When my parents left, they did so quickly, already mid-conversation about schedules and documents. My sister lingered behind. "I'll stay," she said brightly. "Someone should keep an eye on you." I nodded, too tired to question it. Once the door closed behind our parents, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The friendliness drained from her expression, replaced by something sharper. She pulled a chair closer and sat down, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You really picked the worst possible time for this," she said. "Do you have any idea how much stress you're adding right now?" I tried to respond, but my throat felt dry, my voice weak. "I didn't plan it." She scoffed. "You never do." She stood up and moved closer to the bed, her gaze flicking briefly to the door before settling back on me. I noticed the way she looked at the oxygen tube, the line of plastic that had suddenly become my lifeline. For a moment, something in her expression made my stomach twist. Not anger. Calculation. The room felt very quiet. I shifted slightly, adjusting the mask, suddenly aware of how dependent I was. How exposed. The machines around me beeped softly, indifferent witnesses to whatever might happen next. As she leaned closer, I had the fleeting thought that I shouldn't be alone with her. That something was wrong in a way I couldn't fully name yet. Before I could say anything, before I could even call out, she reached for the tube. And in that instant, as her fingers closed around the plastic, I realized just how completely unprotected I was. She didn't say anything before she did it. One moment I was watching her fingers hover near the tubing, my mind still struggling to understand why she was looking at it that way, and the next she had grabbed it and yanked it free from my face. The motion was quick, efficient, as if she'd already decided how much force it would take. The air disappeared instantly. There was no warning, no gradual tightening. My lungs seized as if a switch had been flipped inside my chest. I tried to inhale, and nothing came. My body panicked before my mind could catch up, every instinct screaming at once. My chest collapsed, inward muscles locking ribs, refusing to move. I clawed at the space where the oxygen mask had been, my fingers shaking and useless, brushing against sheets and plastic instead of air. A sound tore out of my throat, rough and broken, nothing like a word. My vision narrowed, the edges darkening as black spots bloomed and swam. The room tilted sharply to one side. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, frantic and uneven, as if it knew it was running out of time. My sister stood there watching me. Her face wasn't angry. It wasn't wild or unhinged. It was tight with irritation, like someone dealing with a stubborn problem that refused to go away. "Stop faking it," she said sharply. "You just want attention. You always do." I tried to shake my head to tell her she was wrong, that this wasn't something I could fake even if I wanted to, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My hands flailed weakly, reaching toward her, toward anything, and she took a step back as if I were contagious. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a strange clarity settled in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of frustration gone too far. She had made a choice. My parents' earlier dismissal echoed in my head, their impatience, their certainty that I was fine. I thought of my mother's crossed arms, my father's eyes on his phone. I thought of all the times I had learned not to expect help. The darkness pressed closer. Just as the room began to fade completely, the door opened behind her. I didn't hear footsteps or voices at first. I only noticed the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes flicked past me toward something behind her. She froze, one hand still clenched around the loose tubing. A man's voice cut through the chaos, calm and sharp at the same time. "What did you just do?" Hands moved quickly after that. Strong, steady hands. The oxygen mask was pressed back over my face. Straps adjusted with practiced efficiency. Cool air rushed into my lungs like fire, painful and overwhelming, and I dragged it in desperately, coughing and gasping as my body fought to recover from the shock. I lay there shaking every breath, burning tears streaming down the sides of my face without my permission. The room came back into focus in fragments. The machines, the ceiling, my sister standing rigid near the bed, and the surgeon positioned between us. Now his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or panic. He checked my vitals, adjusted the oxygen flow, watched the monitors until the frantic alarms settled into a steadier rhythm. Only then did he turn fully toward my sister. "What happened?" he asked again. She swallowed, her confidence returning in pieces. "The tube slipped," she said quickly. "I was just trying to help her adjust it." She overreacted. He looked at the tubing in her hand, then back at her. His gaze was steady, professional, and deeply unimpressed. "That's not how this works," he said. She opened her mouth to argue, but he didn't give her the chance. "You need to leave," he said, his tone firm and final. "Now." Her face flushed. "You can't tell me to leave. I'm her sister." "I'm responsible for this patient," he replied evenly. "And you are interfering with her care." For a moment I thought she might push back harder. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the instinct to charm or intimidate her way out of trouble. But something about his presence stopped her. She muttered something under her breath, grabbed her purse, and stormed toward the door, shooting me a look that was equal parts fury and disbelief. When the door closed behind her, the room felt different. Safer. Quieter in a way that wasn't threatening. I lay there, trembling, my throat raw, my chest aching with every breath. The adrenaline ebbed slowly, leaving behind exhaustion so deep it felt like it had weight. The surgeon stayed nearby, monitoring the machine's adjusting settings, making notes on my chart. He didn't ask questions yet. He didn't offer comfort. He couldn't back up. After a while, when my breathing had steadied and the shaking eased, he spoke again. "Are you in pain?" I nodded faintly. "We'll take care of that," he said. And he did. Later, when I was alone again, I stared at the ceiling, the events replaying in my mind in jagged fragments. The sudden absence of air, the way my sister had watched, the way she hadn't hesitated. I understood something then that I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. What she had done wasn't just cruel. It was dangerous. It crossed a line that couldn't be smoothed over or explained away. Whatever this had started as sibling resentment or competition, or something darker, it had become something else entirely. And someone else had seen it. The thought settled in my chest with a strange mix of fear and relief. For the first time, there was a witness who wasn't part of my family's long, comfortable silence. Someone who hadn't learned to look away. As I closed my eyes, the oxygen humming steadily beside me, one truth became impossible to ignore. I had nearly died, and nothing in my life would ever be the same again. When I woke up again, the room was dimmer, the sharp edges of panic replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion that sank deep into my bones. My throat burned every time I swallowed, and my chest felt bruised from the inside, as if my lungs were still offended by what had been done to them. The oxygen hummed steadily beside me, a low, constant reminder that I was still here. The surgeon stood near the foot of my bed, reviewing a chart. He didn't look startled when my eyes opened. He simply glanced up, met my gaze, and nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I searched for the right answer. The honest one felt too big. "Tired," I said finally. "That makes sense," he replied. He checked my monitors, adjusted a setting, and wrote something down. His movements were calm, deliberate. There was no rush in him now, no urgency, just control. He didn't mention my sister. He didn't ask me what had happened in my own words. He didn't reassure me with empty promises or soft phrases meant to soothe. His silence felt heavier than any speech could have. After he left, a nurse came in to check on me. She spoke gently, explained the medications, asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. What I needed didn't exist in a hospital supply room. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. A message from my mother. "Doctor says you're stable." "That's good. We'll come by later if we can." If we can. Another message followed this one from my father, brief and practical. "Let us know when you're discharged." There was nothing from my sister. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down. The absence of her name felt intentional, calculated. She was waiting. Watching from a distance, deciding what version of events she would offer when it suited her. That afternoon, the surgeon returned alone. He pulled a chair closer to my bed and sat down, not looming over me, not invading my space. The simple act of sitting felt significant, like a signal that this conversation mattered. "I want to be clear with you," he said calmly. "What happened earlier was not acceptable." I nodded, my hands tightening slightly in the sheets. "It wasn't an accident," he continued. "He didn't say my sister's name. He didn't need to. And it wasn't minor." The words settled slowly like stones dropping into still water. I had known this already somewhere deep down, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way I couldn't undo. "It's been documented," he said. "Fully." A flicker of fear moved through me. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," he said evenly, "that it's part of your medical record. It means what I witnessed exists outside of anyone's opinion." He watched me carefully as he spoke, not for drama, but for understanding. "I don't involve myself in family matters," he added, "but I do not ignore interference with patient care." I swallowed my throat tight for reasons that had nothing to do with my lungs. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded again as if thanks were unnecessary. "You should rest," he said, standing. "I'll be checking on you later." After he left, I lay there staring at the wall, my mind racing despite the fatigue. The idea that something had been written down, recorded, made permanent was both terrifying and strangely comforting. For so long, everything that happened in my family existed only in the space between us, deniable and reshaped at will. This was different. This couldn't be erased by silence. Later that evening, I overheard raised voices in the hallway. My sister's voice was unmistakable, sharp and indignant. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I'm family. You can't keep me out." A nurse responded calmly, firmly. "You've been asked to leave for now." I didn't hear what my sister said after that, only the sound of footsteps retreating, angry and uneven. A small, unfamiliar sense of safety settled over me. Not happiness, not relief, just the knowledge that a boundary had been enforced. When the surgeon came back that night, he checked my vitals once more, then paused. "If anything like that happens again," he said, his voice low but steady, "you call for help immediately. Do not wait." I nodded. "I will." He studied me for a moment, then added, "You didn't do anything wrong." The words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my eyes sting, but I blinked the feeling away. He wasn't offering comfort. He was correcting a false belief. After he left, the room grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to surface whether you wanted them to or not. I replayed the incident in my mind, not in flashes this time, but in slow, deliberate detail. The way my sister's face had looked. The absence of hesitation. The ease with which she'd tried to explain it away. I thought about how quickly my parents had accepted that explanation in the past. How easily they would have smoothed this over if they'd been allowed to. For the first time, I felt something solid settle into place inside me. Not anger, not fear. Certainty. What had happened was real. It had been seen. It had been recorded. And it could not be undone by anyone's version of events. As I drifted toward sleep, the oxygen steady and reassuring beside me, I understood that something had shifted in a way my family couldn't control anymore. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. And for the first time in my life, that felt like protection. Once the shock settled, my mind did something unexpected. It stopped replaying the hospital room and started asking why. Lying there with the oxygen steady at my side, I realized that what my sister had done didn't feel impulsive. It felt deliberate, calculated. The kind of act that comes from pressure building quietly over time, not a sudden flash of anger. That thought unsettled me more than the memory itself. People don't risk everything unless they believe they're about to lose everything. I began replaying the weeks leading up to my grandfather's death with new eyes. Small details I had brushed aside before started lining up, forming a picture I hadn't wanted to see. My sister's sudden confidence at the funeral. The way she spoke about the future as if it were already settled. Her insistence that certain decisions needed to happen quickly before anyone had time to ask questions. She had always liked nice things. That wasn't new. But recently, the spending had escalated. New clothes, a newer car, dinners out that didn't match what I knew about her income. I remembered how she'd brushed off questions with jokes, how she'd rolled her eyes and said everything was under control. I had believed her because it was easier than digging deeper. The first real crack came from an unexpected place. A cousin called to check on me a few days after I was discharged. We talked about my health at first, then drifted into polite conversation about the family. Near the end, she hesitated. "I hope things work out for her," she said carefully. "For who?" I asked. There was a pause. "Your sister. She's had a rough year from what I hear." I waited, letting the silence do the work. "She put a lot into that business idea," my cousin continued. "More than she should have. I didn't realize it was that bad until someone mentioned creditors calling your grandfather's house." My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't my lungs. "Creditors?" I asked. "Yeah. Apparently things fell apart pretty fast." "I assumed you knew." "I didn't." After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. The pieces began to fall into place with an awful, undeniable logic. A failed investment, mounting debt, calls she couldn't hide anymore. The inheritance wasn't just money to her. It was a lifeline, the only one she saw. Suddenly, her behavior made a terrible kind of sense. The confidence at the funeral wasn't grief or acceptance. It was relief. The pressure she'd been under had found an outlet, and she was clinging to it desperately. The way she spoke to me that day, hinting that I should prepare myself, hadn't been cruelty for its own sake. It had been warning, or maybe threat. When I thought back to the hospital room with this knowledge, my stomach turned. The timing, the way she checked the door before acting, the complete lack of panic as I struggled to breathe. This hadn't been sibling rivalry or frustration boiling over. It had been fear wearing the mask of entitlement. She had been cornered. That realization didn't soften what she'd done. If anything, it hardened my understanding of it. Desperation explained the behavior, but it didn't excuse it. It made it more dangerous. I began to see a pattern stretching far beyond this single moment. My sister had always believed that consequences were temporary things meant for other people, that someone else would clean up the mess, that apologies could erase damage. Our parents had taught her that without ever meaning to. Every time she crossed a line and nothing happened, the line moved. Every time they smoothed things over, reassured her, protected her from the fallout of her choices, they reinforced the idea that she was untouchable. I, on the other hand, had learned the opposite lesson, that absorbing harm quietly was part of being loved. In the hospital, that dynamic had finally turned lethal. As these thoughts settled in, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. The kind that sharpens rather than overwhelms. I stopped wondering if I had misread the situation. I stopped questioning my own memory, my own instincts. I accepted a truth that felt heavy but undeniable. I had not been misunderstood. I had been targeted. The inheritance wasn't just an abstract future event. It was leverage. And my existence, inconvenient as it was, threatened my sister's sense of security. In her mind, removing me from the equation even temporarily solved a problem. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, my breathing steady and measured. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt something close to resolve. I didn't feel the urge to confront her. I didn't want explanations or confessions. I understood now that timing mattered. People reveal the most about themselves when they believe they've already won. My sister believed that. She believed the will was settled in her favor, that the hospital incident could be minimized or forgotten, that our parents would continue to protect her. That belief made her reckless. It made her careless. I decided then that I would say nothing. Not yet. I would let her hold on to her certainty. Let her walk into the next phase convinced of her own security. The truth I was learning didn't need to be rushed. It landed hardest when it arrived unannounced. As I closed my eyes, the weight of the coming days pressed in on me, but it didn't crush me the way it once might have. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. The will reading was coming. And when it did, everything my sister thought she couldn't afford to lose would be laid bare whether she was ready for it or not. The lawyer's office was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made every movement feel louder than it should. The building itself was old solid with thick doors and narrow windows that let in just enough light to remind you the world still existed outside. Inside time seemed to slow. My parents were already there when I arrived, seated side by side at the long table. My mother's purse rested neatly in her lap, her hands folded over it as if she were bracing for something. My father stared at a folder in front of him, flipping it open and closed without actually reading anything. When they looked up and saw me, their expressions shifted briefly, not with warmth or concern, but with mild surprise, as if they hadn't fully expected me to show up. My sister sat across from them, relaxed, almost cheerful. She leaned back in her chair, one ankle crossed over the other, scrolling through her phone, as though this were an inconvenience she'd scheduled between errands. When she noticed me, she smiled wide and easy. "There you are," she said. "I was starting to think you'd be late." I took the seat farthest from her and said nothing. The lawyer entered a moment later, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. He was tall, silver-haired, and moved with the confidence of someone who had seen too many families unravel in rooms just like this one. He greeted us politely, then took his place at the head of the table. Before he could begin, the door opened again. I felt the shift before anyone spoke. My sister looked up first, irritation flickering across her face as she saw the man step inside. The surgeon's presence changed the air immediately. He didn't rush or apologize. He simply walked in, nodded to the lawyer, and took a seat beside me. My sister straightened. "Why is he here?" she demanded. "This is a private family matter." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Your grandfather requested his presence," he said calmly. In writing. Something tight and uneasy passed over my parents' faces. My sister's smile returned thinner this time. "That seems unnecessary," she said lightly. "But fine, let's get this over with." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I need to set a few ground rules. This reading will proceed without interruptions. All questions will be addressed at the appropriate time. Everyone will remain seated." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your grandfather was very specific about how he wanted this handled." The room fell into a deeper silence. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the soft scratch of the lawyer's pen as he adjusted the papers in front of him. My sister shifted in her chair but said nothing. As the lawyer began with formalities, my attention drifted to the small details. The way my mother's foot tapped lightly against the floor. The way my father's jaw tightened whenever the surgeon glanced in his direction. The way my sister's confidence, so effortless at first, now required effort to maintain. She cracked a joke at one point, something about how long this was taking, and laughed softly at her own comment. No one joined her. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing steady. I wasn't nervous the way I thought I might be. I wasn't hopeful either. I felt grounded, as if my feet were planted somewhere solid for the first time in years. This wasn't about winning. It was about witnessing. The lawyer explained that the will had been amended recently, that additional documents would be read, that certain testimonies would be heard before any distribution was finalized. Each sentence landed with increasing weight. My sister frowned. "Testimonies," she said. "What does that mean?" The lawyer didn't look up. "It means exactly what it sounds like." She glanced at my parents, then at me, irritation flashing across her face. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "He wouldn't have wanted all this drama." I thought of my grandfather, of the quiet way he'd always watched, the long pauses before he spoke, the careful way he chose his words. I thought of the things he had noticed without ever announcing them. Drama wasn't his style. Preparation was. As the lawyer continued, my sister's movements grew sharper. She tapped her nails against the table. She shifted her chair closer, then farther away. Her certainty was beginning to fray at the edges, though she tried to hide it behind impatience. My parents exchanged glances. confusion creeping into their expressions. They hadn't expected this. None of them had. I caught the surgeon's eye briefly. He didn't smile or nod. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to remind me that what had happened hadn't vanished just because time had passed. When the lawyer finally paused and looked up, the room felt like it was holding its breath. "Before we proceed," he said, "there is someone your grandfather asked to speak." My sister opened her mouth ready to object, then closed it again when the lawyer raised a hand. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I had been the one bracing for impact, preparing myself for disappointment for being overlooked. Now I wasn't the one holding my breath. As the lawyer turned slightly toward the surgeon, my sister leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Fine," she said. "Let's hear it." The air in the room grew thick-heavy with anticipation. Whatever was about to be said couldn't be taken back. Whatever my sister believed was secure was about to be tested. I sat there quietly, my heartbeat steady, knowing that the moment I had been waiting for without fully realizing it had finally arrived. And for the first time, I felt ready to listen. The lawyer nodded once and turned his attention fully to the surgeon. "Please," he said, "go ahead." The surgeon rose from his chair without hesitation. He didn't adjust his jacket or clear his throat the way people often do when they're nervous. He simply stood, placed his hands lightly on the back of the chair in front of him, and looked around the room as if making sure everyone was present and awake. "My name is Dr. Keller," he said evenly. "I'm a thoracic surgeon at the hospital where April was admitted 2 weeks ago." My sister smiled faintly, the kind of polite, dismissive smile she used when she believed something was a formality. My parents leaned forward slightly, clearly confused about why this was happening at all. Dr. Keller continued. "I'm here because your father," he inclined his head toward my grandfather's empty chair, "asked me to be." That wiped the smile from my sister's face. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize anything. He spoke the way professionals do when they know the truth doesn't need embellishment. On the morning of April's hospitalization, he said I entered her room during my rounds. What I observed was not a medical complication. It was an external interference. My mother opened her mouth. The lawyer lifted a hand without looking at her. She closed it again. Dr. Keller went on. April was receiving supplemental oxygen due to critically low levels. When I entered the room, her oxygen delivery system had been forcibly removed. My sister laughed once, sharp and brittle. "That's not what happened," she said quickly. She was panicking. The tube slipped. Anyone could see that. Dr. Keller turned his head toward her, his expression unchanged. "No," he said. It did not slip. The word landed heavily in the quiet room. "I witnessed your sister standing over April's bed with the oxygen tubing in her hand," he continued. April was gasping for air. Her oxygen levels were dropping rapidly. Without immediate intervention, the outcome would have been fatal. My father's face drained of color. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's ridiculous," my sister snapped. "You're exaggerating. She's always been dramatic." Dr. Keller didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. "I am not in the habit of exaggerating medical facts," he said. "I am in the habit of documenting them." The lawyer shifted in his seat. "Doctor," he said, "for the record, was this incident recorded?" "Yes," Dr. Keller replied. "In detail, including timestamps, vitals, and witness corroboration." My sister's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she leaned forward. "You can't prove I did anything on purpose," she said. "This is absurd." Dr. Keller met her gaze steadily. "Intent is not required to establish harm," he said. "But in this case, the sequence of events leaves little room for interpretation." The room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in as if the truth itself were taking up space. My mother finally found her voice. "Why are we hearing this now?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why bring this into a will reading?" Dr. Keller looked at her, then really looked at her. "Because your father was concerned," he said. "Concerned enough to ask me to be present if certain conditions were met." My sister shook her head, her composure cracking. "He wouldn't do this to me," she said. "He promised." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Promises," he said calmly, "are not legally binding unless documented." Dr. Keller wasn't finished. "There is another matter," he said, "one that predates April's hospitalization." My heart began to pound slow and heavy. "I was also your father's physician," he continued. "I treated him for several years. During that time, we discussed his health, his concerns, and his family." My sister froze. 3 days before his death, Dr. Keller said your father requested changes to his will. My mother's head snapped up. "What?" "He expressed fears about repeated boundary violations," Dr. Keller said. "Specifically regarding medical interference." My sister's voice rose. "This is a lie. You're twisting things." The lawyer reached into a folder and slid several documents onto the table. "Hospital records," he said. "Nursing notes. Hallway camera timestamps." My sister stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. Dr. Keller's voice softened, but only slightly. "I also want to be clear about something else," he said. "When I intervened in April's room, there was no confusion, no accident. You did not call for help. You did not step back in alarm. You watched. The silence that followed was absolute." I looked at my parents. My father stared at the table, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. My mother's eyes moved between my sister and the documents, her face crumpling as the reality finally reached her. My sister stood abruptly. "This is a setup," she said, her voice shrill. "You paid him, didn't you?" She turned on me, eyes blazing. "You planned this." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The lawyer raised his voice for the first time. "Sit down," he said firmly. "There is more." My sister hesitated, then sank back into her chair, her breathing fast and shallow. Dr. Keller straightened. "I did not come here to argue," he said. "I came because I was asked to tell the truth. I've done that." He sat back down beside me. The lawyer closed one folder and opened another. "Thank you, doctor," he said. "What you've shared is critical context." Critical context. I felt something settle inside me then, something I hadn't known was still unsettled. This wasn't vindication. It wasn't satisfaction. It was the sound of denial breaking. As the lawyer adjusted the papers in front of him and prepared to continue, I realized that everything my sister thought she could control had just slipped out of her hands. And whatever came next, there was no version of this story where the truth went back into hiding. The lawyer waited until the room settled, until the shock had nowhere left to echo, then straightened the stack of papers in front of him as if resetting the world to order. "We will now proceed with the will as written," he said calmly. "What has just been shared provides context, but the instructions themselves stand on their own." My sister shifted in her chair, visibly shaken but still clinging to something inside her that refused to let go. Confidence, habit, entitlement. Whatever it was, it hadn't fully broken yet. The lawyer began with the standard language, the kind that sounds distant and impersonal no matter how much is at stake. Assets were listed, accounts named, percentages assigned. My parents listened closely, nodding as expected distributions were confirmed. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. I watched my sister out of the corner of my eye. With each familiar item, her shoulders eased slightly. This was the rhythm she expected. This was the ending she had rehearsed in her mind. Then something subtle changed. The lawyer continued reading, moving from one item to the next, and my sister's name didn't come up. Not once. She leaned forward, then sat back, then crossed and uncrossed her legs. She glanced at my parents, then at me. Irritation flickering across her face. "Did you skip something?" she asked, forcing a laugh. "You might want to double check." The lawyer didn't look up. "We are following the order specified," he said. He turned a page. "The primary residence," he read, "shall be divided equally between Linda Warren, Richard Warren, and April Warren." My sister's head snapped up. What she said sharply. "That can't be right." The lawyer paused, finally meeting her gaze. "Please refrain from interrupting," he said. "There is more." The room felt unsteady like the air before a storm. He continued listing additional assets, each one allocated carefully and deliberately. My name appeared again. My parents' names appeared. My sister's did not. Her breathing grew audible. "This is a mistake," she said louder now. "He promised me. He told me I'd be taken care of." The lawyer set his pen down. "Promises," he said evenly, "are not instructions." He reached for a separate envelope thicker than the others, sealed and clearly handled with care. "Your grandfather included a personal statement," he said, "to be read in full at this time." My sister stood up. "No," she said. "You can't do this. This isn't fair." "Sit down," the lawyer said firmly. She hesitated, then sank back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as if she might tip over. The lawyer opened the envelope and began to read. "My granddaughter." The letter began. "I have loved you all in different ways, and I now understand that some of those ways were wrong." My sister shook her head, whispering, "This isn't real. I believed that giving you everything would teach you gratitude." The letter continued. "Instead, it taught you entitlement. I believed that silence would keep the peace. Instead, it allowed harm." My mother let out a small broken sound. My father stared straight ahead, his face rigid. "I do not accuse without certainty," the letter went on. "But I have watched patterns repeat themselves for years. I have seen boundaries crossed and excused. I have seen one granddaughter protected at the expense of another." My sister's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, for interruption, for anything. "For this reason," the lawyer read, his voice steady, "I have chosen to exclude Hannah Warren from the remainder of my estate." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My sister sprang to her feet. "You can't do this to me," she shouted. "I deserve this. I need it. I worked for him. I was there." The lawyer held up a hand. "The decision is final." "He didn't know what he was doing," she cried. "He was sick. He was confused. This is manipulation." She turned toward my parents. "You're going to let this happen." My mother looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time I saw something shift. Not defense, not justification. Fear. Realization. The lawyer cleared his throat again. "There is one final portion," he said, "reserved specifically." He read my name. The assets left to me were not excessive. They were intentional. Provisions for health care. A property intended as a place of rest and recovery. Personal items my grandfather and I had shared quietly over the years. Books, letters, evidence that he had been paying attention all along. My sister laughed hysterically. "This is a joke," she said. "She doesn't even need it." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I said nothing. The lawyer finished reading and closed the folder. "The will shall be executed as written," he said. "This meeting is concluded." My sister rushed toward me, her composure gone entirely now. "You did this," she hissed. "Fix it. Tell him to change it back." I met her gaze calmly. "It was never mine to fix," I said. She stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time and found no leverage there. No apology would help her. No anger would move me. She stepped back slowly, her face crumpling as the truth finally settled in. This wasn't just about money. She had lost protection, credibility, the unspoken agreement that someone else would always clean up after her. The lawyer gathered his papers and stood. The surgeon rose as well, his presence steady finished. As everyone began to leave, the room felt emptied of something corrosive, something that had been poisoning us quietly for years. I remained seated for a moment, breathing evenly, feeling the weight of finality settle in my chest. I hadn't won. Something much more important had happened. For the first time in my life, the truth had been spoken out loud, and it had changed everything. The room emptied slowly after the lawyer declared the meeting over, chairs scraping softly against the floor, papers gathered with nervous hands. No one spoke at first. The silence felt different now, not tense or fragile, but exposed. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to misunderstand. I stayed seated as my parents stood a few feet away, uncertain where to look. My sister hovered near the door, pacing like an animal that had run out of exits. Her confidence was gone, replaced by something raw and frantic. The lawyer approached me quietly once the others had drifted a little farther away. "I need to make you aware," he said, keeping his voice low, "that you have legal options regarding what happened in the hospital. The documentation is thorough. The witnesses are credible." I nodded. I had already known that even before he said it out loud. The surgeon had made sure of that. "You don't need to decide anything today," the lawyer added, "but the option is there." Across the room, my sister turned sharply when she noticed us talking. She crossed the distance between us in a few hurried steps, dropping her voice into something almost pleading. "Please," she said, grabbing at my sleeve before I could move away. "You can't do this to me. You know I didn't mean it. I was under so much stress. You know how things get when I'm overwhelmed." I looked at her hand on my arm and gently removed it. "I know exactly how things get," I said. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment she looked younger, smaller. Then the familiar tactics surfaced. "If you press charges," she whispered, "you'll destroy everything. Mom and Dad won't survive that. Think about what it will do to them." I watched her carefully, noting how quickly fear turned into manipulation, how instinctively she reached for guilt. "I have thought about them," I said. "For years." She shook her head, desperate now. "We're sisters. Blood matters. Families forgive." I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to rush. For once, time belonged to me. "I'm not pressing charges," I said finally. The relief on her face was immediate and unmistakable. Her shoulders sagged, her breathing steadied, gratitude rushing in before she even considered what my words actually meant. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I'll make this right. I'll fix things. We can move past this." "No," I said quietly. Her smile faltered. "What I'm not pressing charges because I'm done being tied to you," I said. "Not because I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable." The relief drained from her face, replaced by confusion. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "It does," I replied. "I'm choosing not to spend the rest of my life in courtrooms and conversations about you. I'm choosing peace." Her eyes narrowed. "So that's it?" she asked. "You just walk away?" "Yes." The word felt solid, final, like closing a door that had been left open far too long. "There will be no contact," I continued. "No calls, no messages, no holidays, no emergencies. We are done." She stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language. "You can't just erase me." "I'm not erasing you," I said. "I'm removing myself." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, there was nothing she could say that would change anything. No appeal left to make. My parents approached cautiously, my mother's eyes red, my father's expression drawn and tired. "We didn't know it was this bad," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We never meant for you to get hurt." I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with clarity. "You knew," I said. "You just chose not to see it." My father swallowed hard. "Can you forgive us?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "Maybe someday. But if we're going to have any kind of relationship, it will be different. No more excuses. No more silence." They nodded, subdued, finally understanding that this wasn't a conversation they controlled. As the building slowly cleared, I gathered my things and stood. My sister remained frozen near the doorway, staring at the floor. I walked past her without stopping. Outside, the air felt cleaner, lighter. I took a deep breath, noticing how easily it came now. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of victory, just stillness. For years I had imagined that standing up for myself would feel loud and dramatic. I had pictured anger, confrontation, raised voices. Instead, it felt quiet, grounded, certain. I had been given power, real power, and I had used it to choose myself. As I walked away from the building, I didn't look back. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to me. For the first time, my life felt like it was finally moving forward, not in reaction to someone else's choices, but in alignment with my own. And that I realized was the truest form of justice I could give myself. The weeks after everything ended were quieter than I expected. Not empty, not lonely. Just quiet in a way that felt earned. I woke up each morning without the familiar knot in my chest, without rehearsing conversations that would never happen, or bracing myself for disappointments I could already predict. I moved into the small place my grandfather had set aside for me, a modest house tucked away from busy streets, surrounded by trees that filtered the light into something soft and forgiving. The first night there, I slept with the windows cracked open, breathing in air that felt clean and unhurried. For the first time in a long while, my lungs didn't feel like they were working against me. I noticed the changes in small ways. I stopped flinching when my phone rang. I stopped explaining myself in my own head. I made decisions without asking an imaginary panel of judges whether they were acceptable. I cooked meals I liked, not meals designed to keep the peace. I rested when I was tired without guilt. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in moments. Standing in the kitchen one morning, sunlight warming my hands as I held a mug of coffee, I realized I was relaxed. Truly relaxed. No tension coiled under the surface. No vigilance. I thought about what had been taken from me over the years, not in anger, but with a kind of gentle honesty. I had lost time, safety, the confidence to trust my own pain. I had been taught to doubt myself so thoroughly that even when my body was failing, I still wondered if I was overreacting. That realization hurt more than anything my sister had ever said or done. But understanding it also freed me. I grieved then not for the relationship I'd cut off, but for the version of myself who believed endurance was the same thing as love. For the woman who stayed quiet because she thought silence made her easier to keep. I let myself feel that sadness without rushing past it, without telling myself to be strong. Strength, I had learned, wasn't about absorbing harm. It was about refusing to normalize it. As the days passed, I began to feel something else growing in that space where fear used to live. Not bitterness, not revenge, peace. A steady, grounded peace that didn't need anyone else's approval to exist. I understood then that what I'd chosen wasn't forgiveness in the way people like to talk about it. I hadn't excused what was done to me. I hadn't rewritten the past to make it softer. I had simply stopped allowing it to dictate my future. That choice changed everything. I started writing slowly at first. Not to expose anyone or to relive the pain, but to give shape to what I'd survived. Page by page, I realized how many moments I'd minimized, how often I'd told myself it wasn't that bad. Seeing it written down made one thing clear. It had been that bad. And I wasn't alone in it. As I wrote, I thought about other women. Women who had been labeled the strong one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. Women who learned early that love came with conditions and silence was safer than honesty. Women who had wondered late at night why their accomplishments felt invisible at their own family tables. If you've ever felt that way, I want you to know something I wish someone had told me sooner. Your pain was real. Your instincts were right. And you were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong people. There came a moment standing on the back porch one evening as the sky faded into soft blues and grays when I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology. Not for recognition. Not for anyone to finally understand. I had already given myself what I needed. Walking away hadn't made me smaller. It hadn't made me cold or unforgiving. It had made me whole. The life I was building now wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, was the most stable foundation there is. If parts of my story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been the invisible one in your family, I'd love to hear from you. You don't have to share everything. Even a simple "me too" in the comments can mean more than you realize, not just to me, but to someone else reading who thought they were alone. These stories exist because so many of us carry them quietly. Staying here, listening, sharing is how we remind each other that silence doesn't have to be the end of the story. If you found something meaningful in this journey, I hope you'll stay with us. We share stories like this regularly. Stories about women reclaiming their voices, setting boundaries, and choosing themselves after years of being told they were too much or not enough. Subscribing is simply a way to keep that connection going, to make sure these stories find the people who need them most. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, and for holding space for a story that was once carried alone. Wherever you are right now, whatever you're facing, I hope you remember this. You were never invisible. You were just waiting to be seen by the one person who mattered most, yourself.